So welcome to our webinar series on ethics and humanitarian action. And the title for today is Engaging with the Taliban Then and Now. Lessons learned, lessons spurned. We all know, that the Taliban has abusive and discriminatory policies. We don't know that well how to deal with it. So in that sense, I'm really happy that we've got Antonio to start our conversation here. He worked with the UN in Afghanistan. If I remember, you also once did evaluations for OCHA. That's now already some time ago. And then later he worked at the Feinstein International Center. I believe it was then still called the Feinstein Famine Center. And he's now very active in United Against Inhumanity, that, protest against the atrocities of war and the erosion of asylum. There is one discussant that was supposed to be here, that's Kate Clark, who's the co-director of the Afghan Analysts Network, AAN. She also is a BBC correspondent. At the moment she isn't there. When I see her coming in, I will let you guys know that she is on board. I also would like to welcome Sipi Azerbaijani Moghadam, also an Afghanistan expert for a mighty long time, 3 decades by now, with experience also in other conflict and post-conflict contexts, and she focuses on gender equality and civil society. We also have Said Parto. Just like Antonio and me, we have a vague recollection of times when we were active at the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit. He founded the Afghanistan Public Policy Research Organization, an independent social research organization located in Kabul but active in many parts of Afghanistan. And lately he has been working as a consultant for UNCTAD in Kabul. I welcome you all. I'm looking forward to our conversation. And Antonio, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Thank you, Christopher, and hello to everybody. I hope we're not going to, it's not going to be deja vu all over again, because some of the issues we're discussing today were discussed in the previous seminar that Mukesh and Hugo Slim were involved in. But anyway, let me start. I'm going to start with an anecdote. Back in 2005, or maybe it was 2006, I was doing some research on perceptions of aid agencies in Afghanistan, and I was having a meeting in a community center in the old city of Kabul, and we were discussing the work of aid agencies with a group of women from the neighborhood, it's a very disadvantaged neighborhood. And after listening to them for a while, they started talking about the past and what was the worst period, what was the best period. And it was interesting because they were saying things like the worst period, of course, was when there was fighting in Kabul and the total disaster in 1994, 1995. But the best period for them was the period under Najibullah. And one woman was explaining, well, I used to work in the cotton factory, I had a proper salary, the trolley buses were working, and another one chipped in, yes, and we had subsidized bread from the silo, and there was order. And then the same afternoon, I had a meeting with some Afghan men from the neighborhood. Some were the husbands of the ladies that I had met in the morning. And there was a different motive there. The best period was the Taliban period. There was good security and quick justice. We knew where we stood, not like now when all the young people are taking drugs and hanging around and the women are going out not properly covered. So why I start with this is because things in Afghanistan are rarely black and white. They become more black and white as you go away from Afghanistan. But the narratives about the situation and how it has evolved are always very, very, 50 shades of gray. And I think it's important to understand the differences in narratives as we look back to see what's different and what's similar in the relationship between how the aid community in particular interacted with the Taliban. So I'm going to make 3 brief points. One, the current context, how we could define it. Two, some of the key changes since 2001, and what, if anything, we, the aid community, have learned. So on the current context, just to state the obvious, the Taliban have won. They have brought a level of negative peace unseen in the last 40 years to Afghanistan. There have been relatively few revenge killings, if you compare historically to what happened in France in 1945. What happened in Afghanistan, as far as we know, is relatively minor. And apart from ISK, from the Islamic State in Khorasan, the situation is, the war is basically over. However, maybe a better way of capturing what's happened is to frame the situation today as a kind of post-colonial moment. It follows that Taliban legitimacy in their own eyes, but and also in some of the segments, not all of society, derives from its ability to incarnate victory over the most powerful army in the world, etc., etc. This nationalistic state-building project that is coming out of the victory could be framing the future of Afghanistan for the coming decades. We don't know. It may become a more I'm wondering if this post-colonial aspect will become, in a sense, more important in stabilizing the country than the traditional things that are talked about, which is Islam and Sharia law as unifying factors. Yeah, so a corollary to this this victory, if you like, is that the image of the aid worker, of mainstream aid organizations, which remains deeply culturally, politically, and financially embedded in the West, in the view of the Taliban, who were reasonably able to engage or interested in engaging with the aid community 25 years ago, now they view us more as, they used to see us as sort of benign infidels, and now they see us more as agents of Western imperialism. So maybe that's the context, or how I see it. Second point, what has changed? Well, have the Taliban changed? Ideologically, probably not very much. There's some, with this talk of splits in the movement or factional differences, but that's always been there. Their capacity to govern has probably increased considerably. Their ability to do things and to manage things. Although one shouldn't underestimate, I think, the capacity of governance of the Taliban the first time around. They had very, very little means, and they managed to set up a kind of functioning administration with all its problems. So despite the loss of a huge amount of external resources for assistance, something like $8 billion a year, they're trying, and to some extent successful, in keeping the country together. Their despicable policies are much the same, and probably because they're stronger, they're more in a better position to implement these policies. The other thing that I'd like to stress is that the gaze of the West on Afghanistan has not changed. The levels of arrogance in the international community, whatever that means, but also in the aid enterprise, are more or less the same. We Westerners love to preach to the Taliban. We love to tell them that they are bad because they are not like us. And we should know better because, as was also stressed in the previous panel workshop webinar, sorry, preaching and appealing to principles with the Taliban doesn't necessarily work. And I could go on and on about examples of where we try to engage on issues of principle back in 1998 to 2000, where basically we hit a brick wall because the the position of the Taliban then, and presumably still now, is that, we are theologically inspired. Their trump card, if they disagreed with us, was and still is, you don't want to do things the way we want to do. God will provide, you're welcome to leave if you don't want to stay. And that's why red lines and threats to leave never worked. Just before I came to Afghanistan in '99 as head of OCHA, there had been a number of incidents between the UN and aid agencies and the Taliban where the UN withdrew. And basically every time the UN withdrew, they had to come back, and they had to come back without necessarily having achieved anything of what the reasons of principle that they had withdrawn about. So I think the problem there is the UN never had a BATNA, a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. The UN is notoriously bad at BATNAs. So if we look at the situation today, it's very similar. Presumably the Taliban would be happy if UNAMA disappeared. The fact that the messaging coming out of the UN is so confusing, with UNDP saying we're leaving and the Deputy Secretary General saying we're recognizing, and people on the ground saying probably different things to each other, and there's total confusion in the messaging coming out. That, I think, makes the Taliban reasonably comfortable that they can play the Taliban, the international community, the best way that they can. And they reckon, probably rightly, that a minimum of humanitarian assistance will continue, and that we'll get rid of these political people who are breathing down our neck. So the West, of course, is not helping its case by adding insult to injury. You all know about the seizure of the resources, the reserves, Afghan reserves from the central bank that were taken over by the US and other Western countries. This is seen by the Taliban and by many other people, including some of us and United Against Humanity, as highway robbery, as stealing from the poor to give to the rich, Robin Hood in reverse or whatever. But the way that we look at it is that this is basically collective punishment. A lot of humanitarian assistance had been provided over the past 18 months, keeping many people alive, but this is no substitute for a functioning economy and banking system. So, and what the West is doing de facto is imposing economic warfare on the Afghan population, because they have lost, and economic warfare has replaced the occupation, if you like. What has changed, and Sippy and Kate will be able to say things much more than me on this, because they've been spending more time in Afghanistan than I have in recent years, is the massive access to education, to the media, social media, the exposure to the outside world of Afghan society. Ordinary people have access to phones. In Kate's last piece, she made the comment that in 1996, 1998, you couldn't call, you couldn't call from Kabul to even Islamabad. There were no phone lines, or very few. They were reserved for the elites, or you had mobile satellite phones that cost about $15 a minute, so you couldn't really use them much. So the opening up of Afghan society in general, but mainly in the cities, I would imagine, to the outside world has radically transformed the worldview of Afghans, and that makes the situation on the ground very different from what it was during Taliban 1.0. How much of this has affected rural communities? It's a good question. I would argue that the experience of migration and displacement has had a very important role in the way in which rural communities have evolved over the past 25 years. Some people would argue that nobody is really totally rural anymore in Afghanistan, because there are links with the cities and with the abroad. And in a sense, as we had discovered in another study in Nepal, people have become rurban. You know, they are partly rural and partly urban. They're rurban because they have access to things that used to be mainly urban, like paid employment, for example. You know, a lot of people in rural areas in Afghanistan, according to a study I read a few weeks ago, derive their subsistence not only from farming, but from commercial, from salaried or paid activities that are partly based to agriculture, but also to other things. So that I think is a major change. I won't go into issues of rights and gender, but because Sippy is the undisputed expert on these matters. But I think it's important to point out that at least one thing, that the focus of the international community on rights in Afghanistan has been basically or mostly on civil and political rights, and that the issue of economic rights hasn't had the same kind of prominence. And now we see that the economic rights, the survival rights of Afghans are directly impacted by measures taken by Western countries. So, last point, have we learned anything? Well, the aid enterprise has been present in Afghanistan since the 1980s. It has done much good work, and it has participated in the opening up of Afghanistan to the outside world in many, many ways, in ways similar to what the BBC and the Voice of America programs were doing. So for rural populations, it has had this role. How deep the transformations in rural societies are and how to measure them is a big question. But I think while there has been, while the aid enterprise has been able to have this role of engaging with the rural society, it also has been tainted, and increasingly it's seen as tainted by its Western origins. So it's a complex story here because the love affair between aid agencies and the committees on Afghanistan, the Swedish committee, Norwegian committee, etc., during the jihad period the love affair has kind of changed over time. And I think we're seeing a greater sense of, of concern about the way in which aid agencies function. Some see this as arrogance, as the imposition of foreign values, as tackling conservatives, tackling long-held beliefs in conservative societies is always a complicated thing. But, I think the issue of the baggage that comes with aid, the Western baggage in particular, is something that maybe we have underestimated. And it's coming to more to in the relationship with the Taliban in the future is likely to be an important point. So the insolence or the preaching aspect of telling the Taliban, this can have counterproductive impact, and it probably strengthens the hardliners. The lack of I think it's not so much the aid agencies, but the political discourse coming out of the UN and major donors on interacting with the Taliban is, I think, having probably strengthening the hardliners in the movement because of the lack of engagement that is coming with the promotion of Western rhetoric. And the talk of withdrawing and red lines, and as Mukesh said the previous webinar, I mean, do we suspend health programs in countries where there is genital mutilation? I mean, do we ask the patients in Afghanistan or the beneficiaries of aid whether they would like projects supporting education for boys, for instance, to continue, or should they stop and penalize boys in addition to penalizing girls? So these are all very relevant issues that are likely to, because of the way in which we have collectively been unable to find a productive way or what Nora in her blog calls about a principled, pragmatic way of dealing with these abusive authorities is one of the parameters that we have to consider. I think I've gone over my time, so I'll just make one final point, which is many people are saying, not everybody, of course, and some, Hugo Slim, of course, was saying the opposite of the previous workshop, that there is no alternative to engaging. Even the Americans are saying, Tom West is saying, yes, we must engage. And clearly there's a rift inside the US administration or certainly among the Western donors on how to engage and what this engagement should look like. We at UAI, but also many people in the aid community are arguing that there should be, that preaching to the Taliban is not going to work, and that we have to look for opportunities at the local level, perhaps, to do what was done effectively by many NGOs and UN even during the first Taliban regime, where, according to the Swedish committee, never had so many girls gone to school in rural Afghanistan than during the first Taliban period. That's because the local authorities, the local Taliban, were comfortable with the presence of the Swedish committee and other NGOs that are providing education services. And so, if there's a good relationship, things become possible. So rather than a black and white rhetoric, maybe we should be considering activities, of course, beyond life-saving activities that will probably continue, that encourage a better understanding of each other's perspectives in trying to look, having a common vision of what Afghanistan might look like in the future. That's my final message, I guess.
Let me then quickly introduce Kate Clark, because Kate, you came on board. Kate is the co-director of the Afghanistan Analyst Network, also working as an BBC correspondent. Happy to have you here. Yeah, Antonio, you're in charge, but I would like our three discussants to start responding or adding or questioning to what you've said.
So who wants to start first?
I've got a question, actually. I'm with you, Antonio, on much of what you've said, but I don't see many solutions emerging out of that, or what could be done. And I think that's one of the problems at the moment, that we can all see the problems, but actually finding a way through looks really, really, really difficult. And at the moment, you've got this really horrible situation where, the aid goes through the UN to the NGOs and bypasses the government for, reasons that are understandable. Very expensive, very inefficient, etc., but necessary. And I don't just mean about hungry Afghans. I mean for the macroeconomics. You've got $3 billion worth of aid coming in, and that's, the Afghani is relatively strong currency regionally. Inflation's pretty good. People are getting incomes. It's not a long-term solution. It's horrible long-term, but it's keeping the country afloat. And we saw what happened when the aid tap was turned off in August 21. And yet you're trying to work with a government that does things that are horrible, not just for internationals, but for many Afghans. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure about your assessment that people would rather have the, women stay at home and just the boys go to school and just men working. Really? I think Afghan society has also changed. We've had a whole generation of girls going to school. We've had women working, not everywhere, but it's a different country. And actually, one of the things I've noticed, you remember in the 1990s, there was a lot of discussion about cultural relativism and whether this, women staying home was just Afghan values. and were foreigners trying to impose something by trying to employ women or wanting girls to go to school. You don't hear that now, except from the Taliban and their supporters. That discourse is pretty well gone, and I'm sure it's because so many, there's been a sea change as well in Afghan society, and it is to do with being able to go to school, having schools there. There are lots of problems with multiple problems with the last 20 years, but there have been actual changes in how people see their place in the world. So, going back to the 1990s, where there was a turning of the blind eye by the authorities to much of what went on, and NGOs got on as best they could. Is that the sort of line that you think we should be returning to?
Well, I think we have to be. I'm not there, so who am I to say what should be done? But I think you're right that particularly in the cities and towns, there has been dramatic transformation of millions of girls have been going to school, and it's going to be very difficult to turn the dial back on many of these issues. I think my point is that if you cut down all assistance to education because girls are not allowed to go to school beyond age 12, then you're in a sense making the situation worse. And I'm not the one who's saying this. I mean, Fatima Gilani was saying this at the previous webinar, and I see Mahbouba Siraj has made exactly the same point, that don't penalize us twice. Of course, girls should be able to go to school, but I think you have to ask yourself, what is the best strategy that the aid community or the Western donors or other donors as well to employ in order to achieve this objective. Clearly, the Taliban are controlling things in a much more strict way than they were 25 years ago. And I'm not saying that's engaging rather than drawing red lines and moving out will necessarily be successful, but not engaging seems to be more risky, in my view, than engaging in a principled and pragmatic way. But it's a debate that's ongoing, and I don't think there's one answer to complex questions. Sippy?
And what would you see as engaging? What would that mean? And then I'll give way to Sippy, sorry.
What do I mean by engaging? I think not threatening the Taliban with red lines is probably the first step to make. Of course, it's right for the aid agencies and the wider international community to be clear about its principles. It would be better if they all spoke with one voice, and we've been there, back at the time of reading your paper reminded me of the debates around the Polytechnic and how the Taliban were effective in dividing and creating chaos in the aid community. We tried to ensure that there was, that the UN, at least the UN, would speak with one voice, but it was complicated. You had WHO, who was very, very happy to participate with whatever the Taliban were asking, and then you had, you had New York that was accusing us of being accommodationists, and so it was complicated, and I think we are seeing exactly the same kind of disorder today, which doesn't make engagement very easily if bits and pieces of the UN and of the aid community are going in different directions. We saw that in the in the first few weeks after the takeover in August 21 in the NGO community with positions that changed, and it was not particularly helpful, I think, to have such a disparity of views. I mean, you can't tell the NGOs what to say or what not to say, but the net result was that the engagement with the Taliban back then didn't start on a particularly happy footing.
Shall I go ahead?
You go ahead, yes, please.
Okay. So, Antonio, thanks for that. That was a lot of really interesting points, and I'm going to just comment on some of the points that I thought were really interesting. And the way that I'm approaching this is by trying to sort of put some additional factors in there that we might need to look at in relation to the Taliban. So, starting with the whole issue and the victory, the military victory that you were talking about, I think that there's a sense of, probably a sense of betrayal from the Taliban side, because, they got the victory, they got all the military stuff, but nobody sort of, told them that economically they were going to be, for want of a better phrase, screwed over. So this, I think, it was the beginning of a sense of betrayal and not being able to trust the international community. We spoke about mainstream aid workers, and again, the sense of mistrust can creep in, where on the one hand you see many different organizations trying really hard to engage with the Taliban, but at the same time elements from those organizations in the home countries being extremely critical of the Taliban. So you have this sort of discrepancy which can create problems. So the other difference between the then and now scenario is that back then gender was still relatively new, so people were not really pushing the gender agenda as much as they are now. Now it's kind of the main issue that people seem to discuss. The other thing that was interesting was the whole issue of, what exactly are we engaging with? What were the Taliban engaging with? I was just thinking of the fact that the Taliban were running, shadow governments in many, many different provinces before the so-called victory. And, the areas they didn't have were the main urban areas. So once again, we seem to get sucked into this urban bubble of, like just talking about Kabul. And we rarely talk about Herat. Sometimes we might talk about Mazar. We never talk about Jalalabad. So, we just always seem to sort of veer back towards talking about the Kabul. So I think that's something to be aware of. The other thing that's really interesting here, you were talking about, how things have changed, the internet, telephone. Expectation management has been a huge issue, I think, throughout. Even during Ashraf Ghani's government, I think that Afghans got such enormously raised expectations, especially immediately after September 11th, of what the international community would do, what the government would look like, what the government would bring, what the constitution would bring, what elections would bring. So we just kept ramping up the expectations. And then there was never really that delivery. So then you saw a great deal of disappointment. And I think, really having a good look at the migration figures, especially, more educated, talented people going through legal channels rather than illegal channels, shows in a way, people sort of voted with their feet and left the country. And the culmination of the disappointment, shall we say, as opposed to the expectation, was the arrival back of the Taliban. And similarly, I totally agree with Kate that things have changed. People want work for their women. People want their women to have more of a public presence. That's the sort of expectation and that's the narrative. But once you get those women and you put them in the office and then you try to put them in the office and you go for the nitty-gritty, the conservatism still raises its face. And I say this based on trying to work with female staff all the way up to and a little bit beyond the arrival of the Taliban. You always have, so many things that pop up from the family side, from the community side, etc., which are the leftovers, so the expectations might have developed very rapidly about what women could do, but the practicalities and the feelings of insecurity and threats and risks faced by women, that didn't match the same pace as the expectations. So I think that that's important to acknowledge. The other thing in relation to expectation management is the Taliban are not good at dialogue. They're good at epic sort of gesturing and theatrical presentation of, you know, various elements to convey a specific meaning, but they seem to be really bad at dialogue. So, you know, this creates problems in terms of the expectation management with people. They just don't seem to be interested in dialogue with any or many sectors of Afghan society. And then talking about, you talked about economic rights, and I think that I would very much like to flag up that under the Ghani regime, corruption put these rights in serious jeopardy. So I think that at no time has anyone really looked seriously at Afghans' economic rights. So I think that it's really great that you flagged that up. And, you know, again, in relation to, there's a really interesting thing, and this comes from my PhD research. I really did a comparison of the Taliban and the Mujahideen because I felt that was very important. And the Taliban very much came to other the Mujahideen. They really wanted to other the Mujahideen and stress a difference. And so this also played out in the way that they related to the international community and the aid agencies. You know, the aid agencies, especially the ones who had been solidarity organizations who provided weapons and money for, you know, the dark side of the assistance community back in the early days of the jihad, you know, they were not trustworthy. And if you look at the past 20 years, the perception has been that a lot of these aid organizations worked with the foreign military. So they're still not trustworthy. So, you know, it's a sort of a fraught relationship. And finally, is it really finally, or is there, I think this is my final point. Other stuff might come to me. I think we're not looking at one element of humanitarian assistance, which is the threat factor posed to the Taliban. A development approach would centralize the assistance, you know, into the ministries, etc., which is what we're trying to avoid with the humanitarian assistance. The humanitarian assistance opens up the possibility at provincial level for other elements to gain power by supplying largesse, and it increases the possibility for splintering and splinter factions. So I think that part of the reason that the Taliban want to expedite the end of humanitarian assistance is also the fear of splintering amongst, you know, their own commanders. Because like, there was a period, like around 2016, I was looking at armed groups in Afghanistan, and there was a lot of almighty splintering going on between, you know, Taliban bits and pieces going off, joining a bit of ISIS, then the, you know, the Uzbekistan. We're kind of constantly splintering and forming new factions, etc. And to do that, you need assets, you need, you know, sort of different types of like weapons, money, humanitarian assistance, etc., to mobilize different communities to, you know, do different things for you. So I think, you know, we really have to look at the political economy of the humanitarian assistance as the Taliban see it. And I think that that also plays into this. And finally, in terms of engagement, Kate, you were asking, you know, how do we engage? I think it's not so much, you know, how do we engage? Well, it is how. It's like the modus operandi. And what I have definitely observed is that the Taliban play to audiences. They want to play to audiences, and they play in different ways to different audiences. And I think that the big importance is to take the audience away in order to have a clear, clean sort of environment in which to do the negotiations. So I would say that, you know, the negotiations would have to be done quietly, bring in different people, you know, push for the inclusion of different elements, but do it away from social media and media glare. And that's my commentary. Thank you.
Can I make a comment on Sipi?
Sure, and then we go off to Said.
What you're saying, Sipi, reminds me of a conversation with the chief of staff of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Taliban times in 99, 2000, or maybe he had left by then, was a doctor. I forget his name now. But he was an interesting, educated man. And we were having lunch one day, and he explained that, well, you know, because of the war, Afghanistan has lost out on millions and millions and millions of development assistance that Afghanistan should have received. So we are going to ask for that money back. So it was an interesting way of looking at, you know, that it was their right to development that had been curtailed by the Mujahideen and the Russian invasion and whatnot. So I think that what I don't know is, and maybe you guys who have been on the ground or are on the ground know better, is there more likelihood that corruption would increase if development assistance than in humanitarian assistance? The international media and the SIGAR, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, have been saying that there's lots of corruption. Many other people say no, that by and large the Taliban right now have been pretty good at you know, bringing in tax resources and resources from taxation at the borders, etc. So I don't know, maybe they are frustrated, I'm sure, that the humanitarian funds bypass them, and it's clear that the way in which money is brought into the country because the banking system is not working, it is open to some manipulation. But I'm not sure that there's been that much fraud in the way in which the Taliban control, you know, because NGOs have to pay taxes, some of this money, dollars coming in, goes to paying taxes. But that's no different from what the government of Rwanda does, probably much more and much more precisely in Rwanda than in Afghanistan. So I think it's an interesting question about how corruption might play out in the future, but we're not there yet. So maybe Saeed, can we have your comments on what I said, but also on what Sipi and Kate said?
Sure. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you, Dennis and Christopher, for setting this up. I think we have a lot more questions than any practical immediate answers. So to remain on that track, I want to take a step back and suggest that what we say and what we do, and by we I mean the collective we, the West, regarding Afghanistan, is largely decided in the dark. We don't really know what is going on. We have a lot of anecdotal evidence about this and that. We have some facts, but we do not have a complete picture. And I think part of the reason why we don't have a complete picture is that two things. We refuse to learn and we refuse to acknowledge. I think the first to acknowledge by the West is that the war was lost. Mm-hmm. You were there for 20 years, you lost. Admit it and get on with it, and then do the humane thing of assisting the most vulnerable through whatever means possible. As far as learning, I think one could almost comfortably characterize the Afghanistan experience for the West as a grand failure in 4 areas. One was war on terror, the other one was war on drugs, the other one was state building, and the other one was women's emancipation. Yes, I admit, and I think we all admit, there are some gains that are still there despite what happened on August 15, 2021, and despite all the assistance to Afghanistan being stopped. The question is, how do you keep what has been done if you don't engage with people who rule the country whom you do not acknowledge? So that's the first step that has to be given serious thought, and some of us have been saying this from the 16th of August, that really you lost, and lose gracefully and admit to what has happened, the reality, accept it, embrace it, and work with it if you care for the ordinary Afghan people. there is a risk in not doing that as well. It's not just taking their money and giving it to the victims of 9/11 and various showpieces like that. I think there is a risk that the void that's left by refusing to engage will be filled by other powerful actors in the region. We know China has been extremely active recently. We know Russia is also very active despite its engagement elsewhere. And there are old actors like India and Pakistan that are still lurking around, and even Iran to some extent. So that refusal to engage will result in, yet again, things that we didn't anticipate because we were so doggone prejudiced against something we didn't like, i.e. the Taliban and what they do in relation to rights of women. So, I mean, really what I'm saying is a plea, let's rethink. What have we learned? The things, the failures, the wars that were lost, not just with the Islamists, but also on terror, on drugs, on attempting to build the state, and on women's rights. Let's see what we can keep of what has been accomplished, and then find a way of doing it. And the only way forward really is constructive engagement through whatever means necessary. And I'm wondering what Antonio's reaction would be to that, given your and everybody else's collective experience with Afghanistan.
I think you're right about the collective failure and about the refusal to acknowledge this. And it's worse, it's making Afghans pay for the collective failure. The other thing that came to my mind, Said, while you were speaking, was that where you talked about state building, and I mean, the state is a very loose concept in Afghanistan. I mean, we all have this notion that Afghanistan is a centralized state, but is it? And what is the future of the discussion around the nature of the state in a country where for 40 years, and even before that, maybe even from the times of Abdul Rahman Khan, there's never been a social contract between the people who held the state and the population. And I think that in a sense, both the Taliban 1.0 and the Republic suffered from the same fundamental fault, that there was no social contract, that you know, the Karzai-Ghani regime was seen as a transnational form of government and governance imposed from outside. The previous regimes had been also imposed militarily with very little attempts to engage the population in some kind of a social contract, to make it brief. And I think what's dramatic is the fact that the West invested so much in formal democratic processes without really asking itself whether these processes made sense from an Afghan perspective beyond the people who control the process. So I think, you know, it's going to be tough. Saving people from dying because there's no food on the table is one thing, but rebuilding a transparent and respected, I'm not saying democratic, forms of governance is another. And the risk, of course, is that the Taliban will revert to what they did the first time around, and, you know, run basically a theocracy that is imposed on the people, which in some ways not that different from the Republic, which was also imposed on the people.
Said, would you like to react to that? Otherwise, I would like to give the floor to Kate.
No, I'm happy the way things are. Thank you.
Okay, Kate.
I was going to say the Taliban chose this course. They chose to go for a military victory. And Sippy, they were told that the aid would stop if they they went for that course. I mean, they may not have believed. I think many Afghans didn't realise how much of the economy was reliant on the foreign money that came in, not just the aid, but the military support, the spending of the foreign armies. That went overnight, but that was the choice of the Taliban leadership. They didn't. There were other paths on the table. So, I mean, in some senses, to say that they felt betrayed by the foreigners, well, maybe. I'm not sure it was if that was reasonable. And even now, you know, we talk about engaging. You know, the international actors engaging, but every time there is a push to engage, something happens. So, for example, last year, Nowruz, I think there was going to be an American delegation coming to Kabul. It didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Because the Taliban closed the girls' schools, the secondary schools. In the summer, they were all ready to do some deals on the central bank to try and get the liquidity crisis moving through reforms to the bank. What happened? Sawari gets leader of Al Qaeda, turns up in Kabul and gets killed by the American army. Similarly, in the autumn, there were moves to try and sort things out with with some of the nitty-gritty technical problems that are standing in the way of the sort of real Afghan economy, not the aid economy. And what happens? You have the bans coming in. So I think, you know, it's not just the Taliban that they won and they should be recognised. I do think it's a bit more complicated than that. And I would say for me, the big difference, I mean, Sippy talked about conservative society. Yes, absolutely. But who is in charge? And I would say the natural thing in Afghanistan is for the family to be the point where things get decided, not the state. So, you know, if you come from a family where it's fine for you to go to school, but there isn't a school, that's a problem. And I think, you know, the problem with the Taliban and with early governments that have also imposed restrictions on women and girls and men in the name of, you know, conservative culture or religion is that it takes the deciding power away from where it should be, which is the level of the family. And finally, just one other point, if we're talking about how things change in Afghanistan, it's going to come from within. And I think that has to be acknowledged, that whatever international actors do or the diaspora does, it's somehow of secondary importance to what happens on the ground. And we don't know we don't know how that's going to develop, whether it's, you know, the Taliban are there for the next 30 years or, you know, there's transformational change or sudden change. Back to you.
Yeah, no, just to interject one thing, I agree with you, Kate, about social processes being successful only if they are kind of illuminated from within. Imposed social processes imposed from without generally fail. So I think, but that applies equally to the Republic and to the Taliban. So Sippy.
I think, you know, just to add to that, yes, any regime that has tried to interfere with what goes on within the family has failed. There's been a massive backlash, and that goes for the Taliban as well. And I just want to go back to what Said was saying, you know, and sort of combination of Said and Kate. Yes, change comes from within when it comes to women's issues, you know, sorts of choices, etc. Economic, should girls go to school, should women work, etc., etc. Yes, those sorts of social changes have been shown to come, you know, en masse in society from within the family, and governments just haven't been very successful in changing those issues. And, you know, like in the past 20 years, we had reached a period where things were beginning to shift very gradually, but we had a very, very, very long way to go. But in terms of what Said was saying, yes, there is a black hole effect and a gravitational pull, which, you know, I think we really, really need to look at very closely, which is the Saudi-Iran peace deal and the regional stuff that's happening, which are absolute game changers in terms of what happens in Afghanistan. And, you know, like Afghanistan will be being drawn into this orbit of these new sorts of configurations that are happening in that region. And, you know, just as we had this after the end of the Cold War, we had a vacuum created in that region, which was filled by Iran and Saudi, and then, you know, their proxy warfare. And we had the end of the Cold War, and then the beginning of, you know, the threat of Islam, and Islam as a massive threat, Islamic terrorism, and so on and so forth. This has dominated the last few decades, and I think that we're nearing the end of that period. And now we're moving into a period where we have a new threat on the horizon, which is Russia and China. So everything is reordering itself. And, you know, the region, therefore, will shift again. You know, if China does manage to create a peaceful situation between Iran and Saudi, which actually holds, then this is going to create big political changes for a lot of different countries in that region. The Taliban will be pulled into that. There won't be any other option for them. And that will also determine how they interact with the international community. We've had this narrative where we've told ourselves, you know, that we need to be there. Our presence is absolutely essential. The world would, you know, collapse if we're not there. Do we really know? I mean, do we really know? Has there ever been a period when the UN, Red Cross, NGOs, etc., were not there in our working lifetimes? I don't know. So I'm not sure what would happen. I mean, you know, like, don't get me wrong, I don't think that we should be experimenting with this, and there's a lot of people whose lives are at stake. But I don't know. I think it's a narrative that we need to sort of examine. How much of it is linked to our ego? How much of it is reality? That's just some sort of random thoughts. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, CP. I would like Said to react. Nora, you wrote a chat in the chat, so you may then afterwards like to say something, and I would like to invite everybody to raise their hand and to ask their very smart questions. Said.
Thanks. Just a point on sort of autochthonous inner homegrown forces of change. We have next door, we have a very interesting situation of a lot of women in a very secular fashion standing up against the Islamic fundamentalists of Iran. And what that has resulted in so far is to bring back the useless prince of the defamed Shah of Iran as the leader of the movement. And that has happened because there was, yes, there was movement, but there was no leadership. There was no unified purpose that drove that movement. Afghanistan is not in that space at the moment. Personally, I don't see it generating such a force. And even if it did, I am at a loss to see who is going to lead this movement to take it where it would be better than what we have now. So I think wishing for homegrown forces to affect change, absolutely. But the likelihood of it happening while people are dying in misery and wondering about their next meal, that's a whole different discussion, I think.
Yeah. Nora, do you want to comment on your chat on setting the economy free?
Okay, well, first of all, thanks. It's a very interesting discussion. I'm taking notes diligently because, yeah, very interesting. I don't have any crystal ball for the future either, and all of you who have been speaking understand Afghanistan much better than I. But having worked there and looking at the narratives and given what Said just said, and another person in the chat box talked about the diaspora. So my basic comment is that I think one of the first orders of business for a less difficult Afghanistan is to allow the economy to be freed up. The way I see it, you know, I grew up in a small village. The manufactured poverty and deliberate hunger is not just, of course, unacceptable, but it denies people to look beyond how they're feeding the children this evening. So I think this is something all of us should be engaged in, that it's not just abominable, it's also really counterproductive to trying to get out of this very difficult situation. And unless Afghan families can feed their children, it is not realistic to expect them, you know, to raise their eyes to tackle all the other problems that is coming their way. So I think, yeah, for me, I just want to make that point. And somebody also in the chat talked about the diaspora. And of course, I agree that they've got a much bigger megaphone and are significantly supported by different actors and states in the West. So I think going forward, that is something that also needs to be challenged, that it has to be the people, the Afghans in country who need to be seen as serious stakeholders, even if right now it is very difficult for them to engage. Thank you.
Christopher, what would you like to ask?
Thanks so much for the discussion so far. It's highly informative for an outsider like me, and it brings up some of the fundamental questions in ethics of humanitarian negotiations regarding, as you refer to, Antonio, the red lines and where to potentially draw them. You basically both criticized the UN for not really having a good alternative, a BATNA, and therefore not a strong negotiating position on the one hand, but also you criticized the whole idea of red lines in negotiations with the Taliban and threatening with red lines. And also you didn't comment on the possibility of coordinated positions amongst the different organizations, amongst different actors. So I was basically wondering, is there, in your view, no limit to what sort of compromise humanitarian agencies should make with the Taliban in terms of Taliban decrees for how aid is to be used or distributed, how it can be operationalized. In Syria, you have this notion of a humanitarian plus, where humanitarians sort of fill the void left by the international sanctions. And you see this as a potential problem, that without clear red lines, humanitarians would sort of prop up the Taliban government through their presence. And is that worth the general political costs?
Well, that's a very complex question. It depends what red lines you are talking about. If you're talking about political red lines, like Obama set for Syria, and then when it came to that point, is, oh, well, I didn't really mean that. So it's complicated. I think that to the extent possible, there's a moral principle that ought implies can. We as humanitarians have to do our best to address humanitarian need according to the principles of humanity, etc. Of course, not at the if this puts us in danger or our beneficiaries in danger. There are red lines there that you cannot cross. And if you look at what ICRC does, ICRC is not engaging in this debate about red lines in Afghanistan. I don't know what they're saying to each other over dinner in the evening, but I think it's pretty fair to imagine that the ICRC, if the UN pulled out, will not pull out. And so will probably MSF and Emergency and a couple of others. I think that to the extent possible, one should avoid being put in a situation where you couch things in terms of red lines. And I think that what Saeed and Sipi have said about the regional context and about the potential role of China and India, I think that should bring a level of realism to the position of Western countries, because there's the provision of humanitarian assistance, and apparently the appeal that was launched for 2023 by the UN is very, very poorly, successful. It's like 5 or 6%, and that is a real problem. And I think that the likes of WFP and UNICEF are very worried about this. nobody is going to come in from the new actors in the region, whether it's China or Russia or India or Pakistan, to provide the level of humanitarian assistance that the West is providing. So presumably the Taliban know that. And one lesson from 2000 was that when the Taliban realized that the drought in the country was really having devastating effects, they became much more easy to work with. You know, they were not begging for our assistance, but many of the restrictions on where we could go and what we could do were sort of suddenly lifted. You know, they were still there, but they weren't being applied. So I think it's these kinds of opportunities that one should look for. I'm not saying any of this is easy, and of course we don't know what internal fights might be happening inside the Taliban movement itself, but basically from a humanitarian principle perspective, I would say that the humanitarian agencies have to remain there and do as much as they can with the poor resources that they have. Whether this extends to doing humanitarian plus, that's a different question, because the donors will probably be very unlikely to finance life-sustaining activities. Back in the days, 25 years ago, we had a rigid distinction between life-saving, that was good, and life-sustaining, that was bad. So you got the paradoxical situation that because of the drought, now I'm rambling a bit, but it's an interesting point. Because of the drought, we were trying to procure drought-resistant seed for some of the northern parts of our country, and we went to the donors. And one serious and important member state donor said to us, "Oh no, seed, that's development. We can't give you improved seed." So, okay, but if you don't give them seed, they're going to die. That becomes humanitarian, does it? Yes, yes, but we don't see it that way. So basically, you know, donors can speak with forked tongue too, not just the Taliban.
Okay. Sorry.
Kate,
say something more, Antonio?
Yeah,
no, I'm done.
Okay.
just a
Kate?
couple of things. On corruption, I would expect it to increase just because that's human nature, nothing to do with the Taliban per se. Also, we know they've been very open about their revenues, but not about how they're spending money.
Yeah.
Who gets contracts, you know, the old ways of people connected to the state, benefit procurement, contracts, mining concessions, Usher and Zakat. This week we knew it was being collected by the Ministry of Agriculture, and by the way, that's a huge transfer of resources, new transfer of resources from rural households to the state. That was confirmation now that's going to the leadership, that's going to the Emir's office. We don't know how that's spent. We don't know how the Ministry of Finance taxes are spent or customs. So again, I would say unless you've got full transparency across the whole of the public finance cycle, you can't say whether I mean they're definitely better on revenue connection. I don't know about anything else. We don't know. And on Nora's point about, yes, I agree with you, getting the real economy going should be an aspiration. And there's lots of things that you can see how that could be made easier. Banking. I mean, the sanctions are there on paper. There's a lot of exemptions, but it's still really difficult to get things done because of the fear of the international banks to work with Afghan banks. However, nothing will make up for the huge amount of resources that were coming in pre-August 2021, and that fell off a cliff. Even with this 3 billion of humanitarian aid coming in, it's off a cliff. Things were already going down in terms of living standards as ISAF pulled out and as the money went down. And we know that, you know, the Taliban are doing better at collecting taxes. There's less going into officials' pockets. And of course, it was funding the insurgency as well. The insurgency was also funded by foreign money in the end. But it can't make up for the amount of money that was coming into the country. And I'd say also, if you look back at history, at similar periods in, say, Britain or Ireland's history, what did our ancestors do? They went abroad, huge migration, and that was how, you know, countries in Europe dealt with changes to agriculture. We had the Industrial Revolution, but there were huge out-migration, and that can't happen at the moment. And while you know, the money that Afghans sent home to friends and family is huge, I imagine it's a huge part of why things aren't as bad as they could be. In a place with open borders, I think you would see a lot of Afghans going, and that would actually relieve the economy. That would make a huge difference, but that can't happen. And there's only, you know, what does Afghanistan have a comparative advantage in? Illegal opium. That's about it. Narcotics, illegal narcotics. Not much. So as things stand at the moment, I mean, trying to find ways economically out of this dilemma, it's really difficult to see. I mean, things should have been happening before the fall of the Republic. There should have been a weaning off of the external money. There should be much greater support to the reformers in the finance ministry who were trying to sort things out, but it didn't happen. So, and Nora, while I'm talking about Western Europe, I take my hat off to British imperialism. I'm not ignoring that as an additional factor that the Irish had to face, but you know what I mean. Migration as a factor then that eased economies isn't going to happen now for Afghanistan.
Let's go over to Paul Harvey, because he's been waiting for quite some time now. Paul?
Thanks. And with apologies, I'm going to have to make a point and then leave fairly shortly afterwards. But I was wanting to cycle back to sort of Kate's point right at the start about sort of what does all this mean for what humanitarian organisations in particular should do. And I think it's easy to feel slightly sort of helpless, stuck in the current situation. And I think the sort of three sets of realities you kind of need to accept. One's the reality of what we've been hearing about the limits of any prospects of sort of successful advocacy of the Taliban. But I think you probably also have to accept the limits of any successful advocacy with Western donors. You know, Western politics also isn't likely to change dramatically. The funds aren't going to be released. The Taliban aren't going to be recognised. All the political things that could happen to unlock the situation that way also don't look imminent. And the humanitarian system probably isn't going to speak with one voice. That boat's already sailed probably, and it never was likely to sail anyway. And given those three realities, what you can then do about responding to the ban on female aid workers and not just sort of accepting a status quo ante where you continue providing aid because of the humanitarian imperative, but do it with men-only systems. I think it's probably around sort of accepting the diversity of the humanitarian system in some ways and finding sort of different ways in which different types of organisations can do things. And the sort of under the radar local negotiations that are starting to go on in ways that try and sort of have a renewed focus on women's rights and the ways in which, in localized ways, you might be able to do things in ways that try and, to the extent that you can within those realities, do things differently in ways that have a greater focus on women's rights. So I think it's there's an empty grandstanding element in all sorts of ways, one of which is about how you relate to Taliban, but also how you relate to Western politics and also how you critique the humanitarian system. And if you can think about ways to sort of move beyond that in terms of concrete things you could do differently that aren't just accepting the status quo, that might be one of the way forward for humanitarian organizations.
Yeah. Does any of the discussants or Antonio would like to react to that? Mukesh also raised his hand, and after that I would like to give the floor to CP. Mukesh.
Thanks. The debate reminds me of a patient I once had. Very nasty man. He smoked like a chimney. And really, honestly, this was in my kind of junior days when I was a doctor in Oxford. And the last thing I wanted to do was to treat him. I seriously considered actually messing up his medication in the hope of relieving the world of such an obnoxious character. But in the end, both personal cowardice in kind of doing that, it would have been easy to do, and also some degree of ethics did not allow me. I mean, and the guy eventually died his natural death, and the world was better for it. My point here is that a reasonably ethical physician would never leave. He would be there, he or she would be there till the bitter end, and if only to bring comfort, even if there was no actual medical treatment to offer. So I'm just utterly surprised by a debate in the humanitarian world about even the possibility of leaving. I mean, the existence of the debate indicates that these are not humanitarians. In a way, we're having the same debate now, by the way, in Sudan. So 2 or 3 people got killed in WFP workers got killed in Darfur because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and a few bullets went in the wrong way. And I'm very sorry for them, you see. And, you know, the whole organization suspends its aid. In a way, of course, they may not be able to deliver the aid because the warehouses are looted and the staff are cowering in their homes because bullets are flying around. That's a different matter, but you do not do that. So it's just total nonsense. Number one, humanitarians must stay. The option to leave is never there. The option not to engage is never there. So that, if you like, can be a red line, never to disengage. A kind of green line, if you like. My second point is, are there really idiots out there who are still arguing about the difference between life-saving and life-sustaining aid? What utter total and utter rubbish. I mean, they're probably, I don't know where they are, but I thought the debate was long over. You know, one gives help to people according to their problems in the way that best suits them. Now we have cash aid and God knows how many other types of aids, and you can WhatsApp their aid to them nowadays, and God knows what else, you see. So that debate is finished. If you want to help people, and in a humanitarian way, don't ask how you are, what kind of conditions you're going to attach to that. Just do it. The third thing is, I'm still bemused by this debate on recognizing the Taliban. Well, Afghanistan is going to be there either was there before the Taliban, is there now, and will be there long into the future. And some governments, I mean, the UK government doesn't you know, got its own problems. And that's a separate seminar by itself, you see. But it has one wise policy. It doesn't recognize governments. It requires nations. Many other countries do the same. You know, who cares about whether the Taliban is recognized or not recognized? You know, this is a non-issue. It is a non-issue in terms of, sure, you don't have to send your ambassador if you don't want to send your ambassador, but fundamentally speaking, the Afghanistan as a country exists, and it's a nation with boundaries and so on and so forth. So, you know, we need to get beyond that particular debate. Finally, in the fourth point, well, I think that if the UN is having its moments now for all sorts of reasons, both the internal wokery as well as kind of the politics, as well as cowardice in senior levels of the UN system, with few exceptions, then just bypass the UN. Who says the UN is central to aid delivery nowadays? You see, increasingly, I mean, I've just been talking recently about northern Syria in the aftermath of the earthquake and all Syria's chronic acute problems, and whether the border is open and if there's a Security Council resolution and how long it's lasting and which borders and all the rest of it. Well, there are bypass mechanisms already in existence, not publicized for various reasons, but they exist. So I think many of the problems that we have discussed with, which I think someone said that we have identified the problems but not find the solutions. We have found the solutions, you know, by refusing to recognize as problems. And, you know, there are plenty of Afghan people now, thank God, after decades of aid, better educated men and women going around doing their business and finding creative ways of bringing aid and all that sort of stuff, you see. So this is not a showstopper. The Taliban is not a showstopper. All the issues, the problems that you have raised are not showstoppers. And I really think this discussion depresses me, because we are creating our own problems in the process. And there's lots of good things. I think life will go on, and either we join them or we don't join them. It's irrelevant. But much of this discussion is irrelevant to the realities that are unfolding with or without us. It really does not matter how many evaluations and ethical dilemma projects Paul Harvey, funded by DFID, by FCDO, does or doesn't do. Though I'd be interested in joining in, of course. But so you get my point. We have to rise above the problems, not to kind of capture the problems in ever more refined academic detail, which is much of this discourse has all been about, somewhat disappointingly, Christopher. Over.
Okay. I would like to go over to CP because we're slowly going off time. Antonio, after that, you will have the last word. I'm not sure whether you're happy with that, but I thought it would be nice because you started the conversation. CP?
Thanks. I just wanted to say a big thank you to, well, Mukesh, but also to add that, yes, you know, I think somewhere in the middle of all this is the tyranny of the project approach. And I think part of the problem, you know, like, for instance, I personally on the side, behind the scenes, have been advocating to pull together, you know, all of the Afghan women, like, thoroughly capable of tackling the Taliban and providing support for them to become a viable platform. But bizarrely, there's no appetite for this because there is this bizarre sort of tendency to approach things through very cookie cutter models, which is, you know, projects in Afghanistan to do X, Y, and Z according to what donors say. And then on the other side is providing these platforms for the diaspora who are pretty much, you know, sort of fighting for their former privileges in many cases to provide critiques of the Taliban. But in the middle, we're missing that support to a movement.
Well, let me say that I agree with everything that everybody has said. Particularly the last three speakers. So seriously, I think there are spaces that savvy humanitarian actors, local, of course, and sometimes international, can occupy, and that we should not sort of withdraw intellectually from the possibility of changing things on the ground. I was speaking a couple of days ago to the director of a medium-sized organization that works in difficult places like Zabul and Kandahar province, and a bit also in the center of the country. And they do health services and some protection. And so I was asking, well, you know, how have things changed down in Zabul? Zabul is not a particularly sort of at the spearhead of social change, let's put it this way. It's a pretty traditional place. And say, well, you know, we've been working here for the past 5 or 6 years, and we have mobile clinics that go around the villages. And of course, when the Taliban came, we knew them because we were working with them for the past few years. And they said, yeah, no problem, you can continue doing what you want, as long as your women are covered. And, you know, but there's no difficulty in moving around. And there's been no major change for them, despite all the edicts, in Zabul. In Kandahar, it's a bit different. And because, you know, presumably the presence of Mullah Hibayatullah in the neighborhood makes things more different. And they've been told, you can't do mobile clinics anymore. You have to, people can only come to your clinic, and, you know, women can come if they're accompanied, etc. So why am I saying this? Because I think it shows that there's probably, as Medina was saying, many possibilities under the radar that we're not exploiting, and that the last thing that we should do is sort of give up in our pressure or negotiation or advocacy vis-a-vis the Taliban. Of course, it would help if the UN spoke with one voice. It would help if the NGOs and the UN spoke with a smaller number of voices. And, you know, going back to 99, 2000, 2001, before the fall of the Taliban regime, we had mechanisms that the aid system had kind of agreed to through the principal common programming and the strategic framework. And, you know, it wasn't perfect, but if you compare 95, 96, 97, when we didn't have those tools, and the following 3 years, I think the aid system learned that speaking with one voice and not undercutting for reasons of principle or non-principle what others are doing, guarantees a better collective response. So I agree very much that there's a leadership issue here in the aid community, and that we should be more demanding of our leaders on the ground in terms of at least being able to come up with common, I'm not saying common principles, but common modalities of dealing with authorities that have despicable policies, but that may be there for the next generation. So, I think Mukesh is right. We have to think long term here. We can't just say, oh, we don't like you, we're going to leave. So on that, I will say Eid Mubarak to everybody, and thank the organizers and all the participants. I think it was very informative. I thought it was very interesting how we managed to come up with the gamut of issues that from a humanitarian perspective that we're struggling with in Afghanistan, but not also. We'll be struggling with the same issues in Sudan or God knows where. Myanmar, another good example.
Yeah. I would like to thank, Antonio, of course, the three discussants, all the participants for what they've said, and for their questions, contributions. I would like to thank you all, and we'll hear and see more from each other. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks very much, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.